Welcome to our Walk in My Shoes series for professional advisors. Here in the UK, we are currently in LGBT+ History Month, which has the aim to promote equality and diversity for the benefit of the public. And so today, our international panel of experts will be exploring the issues facing the LGBT+ community and their impact. My name is Sophie Sahanek. I'm the Director of Membership and Development and your moderator for this series. As a not-for-profit organisation, Philanthropy Impact exists with the mission to increase and improve philanthropy and social investment and to also encourage impact investing. If you have any questions about what we do, the training we offer and how we can collaborate, please get in touch with me directly in the chat today. As this is a strictly 30-minute session, we are taking questions, but we ask that you use the chat function to introduce yourself and have your say, and to pose your questions to our panel. Please make sure to add panelists and all attendees if you'd like to interact on the chat and remain respectful to all throughout. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce our chair for this session, Daniel Gerring, who's partner at Travers. And joining Daniel, we welcome Kevin Jennings. I think he's running a little bit late, but he will be here. CEO of Lambda Legal. Matthew Hart, Director of the Global Philanthropy Project. Cindy Rizzo, who's Vice President of the Social Justice Programme Arcus Foundation. And Chris Whitewoods from the Queer Britain Advisory Group. Thank you all for your time and insight today, and I will now hand over to Daniel to make a start. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. Good to have you all here, and it's a real privilege to be chairing such an amazing panel. We really do have a great mix of speakers and people who are going to be able to give us an incredible overview, even in only 30 minutes, of what's going on in this field. So I was given the slightly unenviable task of basically telling you all what the problems are for LGBT+ people around the world in 2 minutes. I will not try and do all of that because our panelists are going to do some of it, but I will say a few words. So as was observed, I'm a partner at the law firm Travers. I also a chair of a UK charity called Just Like Us, which is UK's charity for young LGBT+ people, and I sit on the board of another charity which is called Give Out, which is the UK charity platform which aims to provide an effective way of giving to fund LGBT+ activism worldwide. So wearing a number of different hats, I see a range of different things. And if I think about that sort of exam question, starting off by looking at it really close to home, Just Like Us only last week published the first big-scale report into the impact of COVID on young people's mental health. And what that showed was that young LGBT+ people are twice as likely to worry on a daily basis about their mental health and to feel lonely. Just a tiny snapshot, but really interesting live research. On an international level, through the work that Give Out does, I see all sorts of challenges, and I should say some of those are exacerbated by COVID. Many of them were there before and will be there afterwards. And one of the themes I think would be really great to draw out in these discussions is around thinking about what the new normal might look like after COVID, and maybe thinking about it being a platform for us to develop new and interesting ways of supporting LGBT+ people all over the world. So I think I will at that point ask each of the other panelists briefly to introduce themselves, and then we'll move on to some questions. I'm keeping an eye on the chat function, so do let me know at any point by chat if you want to raise a question or make a comment, and I'll try and feed those in as we go through. Shall we start with for introductions? Why don't we start with Cindy? She's the first person I can see on my screen.
Sure. I'm Cindy Rizzo. I am based in New York City in the US. I am the Vice President of the Social Justice Program at the Arcus Foundation. Arcus is a private foundation with a living donor. We fund work on LGBT rights and protections globally, and on conservation of great apes and gibbons. And the foundation's been around since around the early part of the 2000s, so around 2000, 2001.
Sorry, I'm having problems unmuting myself, which is the bane of modern life. I can see Kevin has just joined us. Kevin, I wonder if you'd like to introduce yourself next.
Sure. First of all, it's good to see my old colleague, Cindy, with whom I worked at the Arcus Foundation for 5 years. My name is Kevin Jennings. I'm the CEO of Lambda Legal. Lambda Legal is America's oldest and largest legal rights advocacy organization for the LGBTQ community and everyone living with HIV. I am the former CEO of the Arcus Foundation as well. And in this space, one of the things I've worked on most recently is I'm an executive producer on the documentary Welcome to Chechnya, which has just been shortlisted for the Academy Award for Best Documentary, and which explicates the horrific situation ongoing in the Russian Republic of Chechnya.
Thank you. Matty?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Matty Hart. I'm the director of the Global Philanthropy Project. I am based in Paris, and I use he, him, they pronouns. And the Global Philanthropy Project is a collaboration of 21 public and private foundations who work together to advance and increase resources for LGBTI people, principally in the global South and East.
Fantastic. Chris?
Thanks, Daniel. I'm Chris Whitewoods. I sit on the advisory board for Queer Britain, which is aiming to establish the UK's first LGBTQ museum to tell the stories of our community, not only within the UK, but from around the world. And I'm also the Director of Giving at London Business School based in London.
Brilliant. I told you we had an impressive panel, and there you are. So we are going to go straight into some questions to get things moving. Kevin, I wondered if you might like to talk about the Equality Act to start with, and why it's such an important thing for LGBTI people in the US, and maybe also sharing your reflections that you have on kind of parallel issues internationally.
On mute, there I'm off. For people not familiar with US politics, the Equality Act is a recently introduced piece of legislation in our Congress that would guarantee equal protections under civil rights laws for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people in America. As a former history teacher, I have to say it is about time that Congress finally acts on this. The first version of the Equality Act was introduced in 1974, which is 47 years ago. Its original sponsor, Bella Abzug, has been dead for 23 years. It is long past time for the American Congress to guarantee equality for people based on sexual orientation and gender identity. I think that we live in a world where in the United States, we live in a country where crossing from one state border to the next can strip you of your rights, depending on where you live, and that is true globally as well. One flight can strip you of your recognition of your marriage, your guarantee to equal treatment, and in a dozen countries can strip you of your right to be alive. So I think that what we need in the United States and around the world is the provision of basic protections based on sexual orientation and gender identity in, frankly, most of the world. The places that genuinely extend those protections and enforce them are few and far between. And I'm sad to say the United States is not one of them yet.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty incredible state of affairs, isn't it, really? Speaking as a lawyer, the UK, in many ways, has a good legal infrastructure and has done for some time across many areas. That's not so much the case for trans rights, it has to be said, and we are in an almighty mess at the moment trying to do something about that. But I'm not sure in the UK we always appreciate the level of privilege that we have had for really quite a long time when you compare it to some of our sort of brothers and sisters elsewhere. And sadly, of course, the legacy of British colonialism has left us with a pretty awful position from a statutory perspective all over the world. And I'm currently trying to work on something in one of our overseas territories where gay marriage is still not available, for example, and we're barely getting domestic partnerships. Cindy, I wonder if you might like to share a couple of thoughts on this same question before we move on, and anybody else as well.
There we go. Sure. You know, there is a lot of unevenness in terms of coverage of LGBTQ protections in the U.S. And abroad. And we fund in countries where, like South Africa, which has written in its constitution,
Have we lost Cindy, or is it just me? We have lost Cindy temporarily.
I think we have.
Okay. Well, Matty, do you want to? I think I'm interested in your thoughts on this, and maybe Cindy will come back in a moment.
Well, I mean, I can only comment. You know, the Global Philanthropy Project is a collaboration between 20 public and private foundations who support any number of initiatives and long-term strategies and thematic areas of work. I think litigation and impact litigation, and that is a particular strategy that is regularly funded. And I think that grant makers are often, and I think high net wealth individuals and advisors are in positions regularly where they have to measure the political opportunities, and to measure their investments, and also have the long-term commitment to build the political infrastructure of our movements to seize the opportunity when it arrives, right? Like much of this infrastructure, especially in legal work, cannot be built overnight. And our movements need this long-term sustained funding and donor partners who understand that work takes time. I guess
I think that's a very interesting insight. And I mean, one of the things Give Out is just in the process of launching is a legal fund, which we're still looking for supporters for. And you know, one of the things I've observed is that a lot of this work goes on internationally on a goodwill basis, and I see people who often can ill afford it having to, you know, even fund their basic expenses out of their own pockets, just flights and things like that. Not to mention, you know, all the time they spend. So I think, you know, it's an interesting area which could really kind of benefit from more support. Cindy, we've got you back. Excellent.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what happened, but I'm glad to be back.
We're glad to have you back. Do you want to just finish off your thoughts there?
I was just saying that some of the places where we fund criminalized LGBT work, LGBT relationships, and that some of the states we fund in the U.S. are also very varied in terms of being places where people have protections, like New Mexico, and where things are really difficult, like Florida, which really has, in spite of very robust movement there, has not been able to get over the finish line for statewide equality, even though there's been incredible efforts to make that happen. So we're funding in many different places, most of them challenging places.
Fantastic. Chris, did you want to add anything before we move on?
No, I suppose the only thing I would add to that, I think, with the Equalities Act in the UK, it's made such a big difference, certainly in my time, in my working profession time, where I have been very fortunate not to have experienced the challenges that I know so many brothers and sisters around the world do in bringing their true self to work. So yeah, it's a huge impact, certainly on the positive from the UK perspective.
Yeah, and something which, you know, without becoming political about it, we do need to watch as we move out of Europe, you know, given the genesis of a lot of that legislation was from the EU. Right, let's move on to Matty. There's just so much we could talk about, but one really exciting thing that I've seen come out of his organisation recently is some research which has a sort of COVID focus, but which is looking at where are the resources for LGBTI people around the world. And I think it'd be great, Matty, if you could tell us a bit about that and some key findings.
Sure. And I'll be brief, just recognizing we have a short amount of time and want everybody to have a chance to speak. TBP does produce a fair amount of research, and it's one of the key roles that we have as an organization, which is to equip grant makers, foundations, policymakers, and high net wealth individuals and advisors with real data so that they can advise less on a feeling or on who has proximity to them, but rather based on solid, well-organized research. And we began a monitoring project with COVID, I would say probably in March, as it was beginning to hit the global North and West. And this report that we recently just published, and I'm just going to drop it into the chat for everyone to see, is our most comprehensive. And what we did was actually do an analysis of nearly 5,000 resource flows and mechanisms that were built and designed as humanitarian mechanisms. And I would say about a third of those were new mechanisms or newly tuned mechanisms to address the COVID pandemic. And at the time, there's a lot of conversation about LGBTI people being included, being not included. Many public and private foundations and individuals and networks of people were mobilizing resources. So there was kind of a panic. And what we decided to say was like, okay, what is really happening? What is the actual amounts of money? Who are the deciders in the mechanisms? How are the policies being made? So, and how do we distill the noise so that we have a clear sense of a path forward in terms of how we can impact and inform the specific functions of these flows so that bigger and better resources can go to LGBTI people. And what we found was broadly, governments, donors, and service providers largely failed to acknowledge LGBTI people. In fact, there was one mention of LGBTI people within 4,467 mechanisms that we analyzed. And none of the almost 3,000 recorded resources tracked to the UN Global Human Rights Resource Plan, the GHRP, if you all are that nerdy, explicitly described LGBTI people. And then on the other side of that was, what about traditional philanthropy? What about our members? And how were they responding? Because there was also an emerging narrative that grantees were losing resources, that they were being locked out. And what we did is we asked for a very extensive survey around their sort of grants performance and their management. And what we learned was, in fact, by and large, something like 88% of our respondents said they either relaxed, reduced, or eliminated all reporting requirements. Many extended or did no contest extensions to their grants and other issues. But I think what's most important for this group is that while LGBTI philanthropy rose to the occasion and met this inflection of this crisis, what we're really saying is that we're doing the work of humanitarian agencies, and that there's a pipeline of political work that is not being funded because our historic LGBTI philanthropic infrastructure are funding food programs and sanitary programs. That is wrong. So one takeaway on this call, I would say, is if you're interested in supporting LGBTI work in response to COVID, fund the political work to get the governments and the mechanisms to serve our communities as we are entitled.
Very powerful. I mean, I was really struck looking at some of your papers in advance of this call with one of the statistics which showed that I think it was only 4 cents out of every $100 of international development efforts from donor governments went towards LGBTQI projects. 0.04%. I was really struck by it.
It's difficult to even conceive that number, right?
Yeah.
I wanted to add on to what Maddie's saying, that especially now we're seeing a very uneven distribution and availability of the vaccine across between the global north and the global south. And I think that that'll be exacerbated in LGBT communities around in the global south. So that's another opportunity that funders can really look at and see how they can contribute to the equity issues around distribution of the vaccine, because you know, this is really a serious situation. And you know, people, and this benefits the global north. People will not be able to travel safely until this vaccine reaches people all throughout the globe. So I think there's a bit of self-interest there, as well as there is a bit of altruism in terms of making sure that there's an equitable distribution of the vaccine.
Thank you very much, Cindy. I'm going to move on to Chris before coming back to Cindy to finish. We talked a little bit earlier, Chris, about your own experience of the workplace, and something which we thought it'd be interesting just to unpack a little bit more with you, really. I mean, what are your kind of takeaways and your top tips for encouraging better equality and inclusivity in the workplace?
Yeah, sure. So I've worked sort of across the third sector and the arts sector mainly, and most recently now in higher education. And certainly in terms of sort of that encouraging equality in the workplace, I think it really is honestly creating an environment that fosters and encourages LGBT people and LGBTQ people to sort of really live themselves honestly and be role models. Certainly I've been incredibly fortunate throughout my working career to come across very little sort of objectivity to the way I live my life. And I've, you know, on my desk, I find it's important for me to, like my, you know, my colleagues have pictures of their families. I also have a picture of my husband and my children, and encourage those conversations as actively and openly as possible. The other thing I would say to that is equally, you know, allies are as important as being a member of the LGBTQ plus community, and having allies who are happy and prepared to speak out openly if they, you know, come across things that aren't as they should be. I would encourage people to ask questions, but again, think before you speak. So, you know, ask the question respectfully and appropriately. The way that you would ask a donor something, you would think before you speak. In the same way, you know, make sure that the environment is an appropriate place. Make sure that the conversations you're having are respectful to the person you're talking to. Just two other brief things like, you know, don't make assumptions. So certainly, you know, the LGBTQ or QI or plus, you know, different words have different meanings and resonance for different people. So particularly the queer word, in the last 10 years among my friends and I and colleagues has been a big conversation. For some people, that's a very powerful word and a word that they very strongly identify with. For other people, personally for myself, it's not a word I identify with, not a word I would wish to use for myself. So I think it's just that assumption of, you know, let's not categorize that by age, by gender identification. They're all part of the richness of the community that we are. And I guess if you're in a position of power in your organization and can make some of those differences, you know, small things like visible pronouns on your footer, on your email, if you have the ability to make changes in your working environment, making sure that you have gender neutral toilets so that it doesn't put, you know, people in a position where they have to make those thoughts and decisions just to use very basic services. So they would be my kind of sort of very brief, a few things about encouraging that open environment in the workplace. And I'm sure other colleagues on the panel will have some views on that.
No, I mean, I think that's really interesting. One of the things I said within my business, I don't know, 18 months, a couple of years ago, to our board, I was having a conversation, and I said, listen, I just want everybody to have an option to put pronouns on their emails. It's zero cost and actually quite significant impact, and it's had a fantastic take-up rate, and is becoming, I would say, much more the norm now. And you know, especially when something's free, then easy thing to do. Right, I just thought Cindy, if we can finish up with you. You touched on the subject of sort of unequal distribution of all sorts of things, including the vaccine, but you know, help and also problems. Just wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about the strategy that you're adopting at Arcus, and in particular your sort of areas of focus.
Sure. work is encompasses three large goal areas. One is trying to ensure safety for LGBTQ populations. The second is to promote and advance protections. And the third is acceptance and inclusion. And all of those are huge areas. So we have to have sort of a point of view and a stake in the ground in each of them. We fund geographically in regions in Southern Africa, with specific countries in each region, Eastern Africa, East Africa, Mexico, 3 countries in the Northern Triangle of Central America, and 2 countries in the Caribbean, and then in some of the southern, southeastern, and southwestern states in the United States. So we're really trying to focus our resources on specific countries and specific states in order to better assess the impact that we're having in those 3 goal areas. A lot of what we fund is the pushback against religious exemptions, which has become a really big problem in trying to water down the rights, the long fought rights that we've won, especially in the US, but it also shows up outside the US, where the religious right in our country and other global north countries are trying to have an impact in the global south to restrict rights there and to basically promote homophobia and transphobia in many different countries. So those are basically that's the shortest Cliff Note version of what Arcus is doing, but I put a link to our website on in the chat, and people could look more. And I'm certainly also very happy to engage with people via email at crizzo@arcusfoundation.org.
Thank you very much. And I can see John has popped up, which is, I think, cue for this being wrapped up soon.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Barely enough time to even touch on this topic and the issues evolving from it. So we hope to have something more in depth in the autumn with hopefully the same speakers. So I'd like to end with each one of you giving 30 seconds final words of wisdom. So Cindy, can I start with you?
It was a pleasure to be included here. And as I said before, I'm very available to speak with anyone who's joined today to follow up on both what Arcus is doing, but just generally on any of the topics that were raised.
Thank you. Matthew.
Yeah, a real pleasure to be here and excited to keep developing this space for your members and participants. And, GPP is here as a resource for advisors, high net wealth people, foundation members, and policymakers to make well-informed, data-based decisions to help right the ship of funding equity and increase resources for the global South and East. So you know where to find us.
Chris, final words of wisdom the audience can take away that can inspire people.
Yeah, just I guess to say that, we often talk about the importance of diversity. I would definitely say for those of you who are in a position where you're recruiting or where you're steering your organisation strategically, really do think about that kind of as a notion of diversity, really enriching your organisation and what that can bring to the conversations that you have on a daily basis.
Thank you. Kevin, hi, how are you? It's been a while.
Hi, John. Good to see you again.
Final words of wisdom, please.
2 quick lessons. Number 1, the activists in the countries know more about what they need than we do in the global North and West. So simply listen to them and fund what they are telling you they need to be funded. We are not smarter than they are. And number 2, recognize that change takes time. The first gay marriage lawsuit in the United States was filed in 1970. We won 45 years later in the Supreme Court. The first lawsuit in which we argued that Title IX should protect gay people from employment discrimination was filed by Lambda Legal in 2006. We won 14 years later, just last year, in the Supreme Court Bostock decision. Change takes time. Be patient.
Thank you, Kevin. Okay, thank you, Chris, Cindy, Matthew, and Kevin, and Danielle. Thank you very much for chairing. And final words of wisdom from you.
Goodness, final words of wisdom. Well, I think what Kevin has just said is spot on. I think, you know, we need to find ways of funding this work which has the appropriate power dynamic, and you know, the organisation I mentioned that I'm on the board of, Give Out, is one of those routes, and there are others as well. And I think, you know, we should always be guided by the people on the ground. Same with young people. The other charity I sit on the board of, we talk to our young people all the time, and that research I mentioned was, you know, a small part of that, and it guides our work day in, day out, and it also empowers us to keep going because we hear from them and we hear why it's important.
Okay, Daniel, thank you. Sophia.
Thank you all so much. As there's so much to be covered here, and I know we've only just skimmed the surface of what is possible. So as John mentioned, we will be exploring this event in depth in the autumn with a real focus on solution opportunities for philanthropists and impact investors. So please keep an eye out for the invitation for that. We will be back next week with our Walk in My Shoes, exploring the topic of restorative justice and philanthropy. And this Thursday, the 25th of Feb at 4 p.m. GMT, we have an hour-long event with Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors discussing effective philanthropy with an international panel. Hope to see you there, and in the meantime, have a wonderful week. Speak soon. Bye.